Texas, the Lone Star State. Today, with each step, I journey closer to standing on the highest point in Texas. Being surrounded by these massive, rugged limestones rising over 5,000 feet from the surrounding desert, I reflect back on the history of this majestic landscape, walking in the footsteps of the countless others before me. This journey that is going to take me all the way back to 10,000 years ago, when the first signs of inhabitants came to this part of the country. There's very little known about these early inhabitants other than that they were hunters and gatherers living in and among the many caves and alcoves throughout the mountain range. Since then, many other inhabitants ventured into the area. Like in the mid-1500s, the Spanish arrived and introduced horses into the area. However, there's very little evidence that shows large-scale settlements from these settlers, or like the Mescalero Apaches, who, after the war with the Comanches, were forced to retreat from the plains into the Guadalupe Mountains as their last stronghold. They were only able to survive by utilizing the native animals and plants in the area, like the mule deer, elk, bighorn sheep, and agave. Prior to the 1800s, the Guadalupes remained a sanctuary for the Mescaleros until the arrival of the westbound stage of the Butterfield Overland Mail Route. For 11 months, the Guadalupe Mountains laid in the middle of the 2,800-mile bi-weekly route from St. Louis all the way to San Francisco. Now, this route didn't only carry mail, it also carried passengers, but it was no luxury travel arrangements by any means. Imagine, if you will, 25 days of pure torture being squeezed into 3 rows, knees interlocked with your fellow passenger, suffering from the same lack of hygiene as your neighbor, traveling in the same extreme heat in the summer or intense cold in the winter. All this with infrequent stops and the threat of an Indian attack. You see, the Mescalero Apaches were trying to defend their land, and they attacked stages, settlements, cattle drivers, and stage lines who continued to invade and try to claim their lands. The federal government eventually had to get involved and sent thousands of settlers out west and helped set up forts to protect the travelers and settlers. These soldiers, primarily black soldiers who stayed in the army after the Civil War, were put into service to control the hostile Indians on the Great Plains. The ironic part of all this is that these soldiers had just recently gained their freedom and were now being forced to take freedom from these Indians who were just trying to continue living the life that they have always had. These soldiers eventually got the nickname the Buffalo Soldiers because of their dark skin, curly hair, and fierce fighting attitude. But unfortunately, like most black people during this time, they faced extreme unfair treatment, being commanded by white officers and being subject to unimaginable hardships and never-ending prejudice. Over the 20-ish year war with Indians, the Buffalo Soldiers, when they weren't at war with Indians, helped explore and map much of the little-known region, playing a huge role on the impact of the Guadalupe Mountains today. By the late 1800s, much of the Mescalero Apache land base was rapidly decreasing, which was hurting their food and water supply. Eventually, so much so that most of the population was forced out and put onto reservations. However, even with the Mescaleros gone, permanent settlements were still very rare. Most settlers found that the mountain range was too rugged and inhospitable. The Butterfield stage route was even eventually abandoned in less than a year for a more southern route with more water and better military protection. But there were still a few people that prospered in this unique landscape. The first successful settlement was in 1876 when the Raider brothers settled what is now known as the Frijole Ranch. In 1908, another ranch was settled by James Williams, 5,000 feet below the western escarpment or cliff of the Guadalupe Peak, known as the Williams Ranch. In the 1920s and 30s, the Frijole Ranch, Williams Ranch, and a lot of smaller ranches were bought out by Judge J.C. Hunter, who made a large-scale operation called the Guadalupe Mountain Ranch. He had a vision of the land eventually being a public park to be enjoyed by all one day. And after his death, his son, J.C. Hunter Jr., sold 80,000 acres of land to the National Park Services for $22 an acre. The first talks of turning the land into a national park date all the way back to early 1923, but the idea did not become a reality until geologist Wallace E. Pratt entered the picture and bought what is known as McMittrick Canyon today. In the 1960s, Pratt donated nearly 6,000 acres of the canyon to the National Park Services. With both the Guadalupe Mountain Ranch and McKittrick Canyon, Congress passed the necessary legislation in 1966 for it to become a national park. By 1972, Guadalupe National Park was dedicated and officially open to the public for all to enjoy. So as I sit here on top of this summit, overlooking all of Texas, I can see the history of this part of the state that I grew up in and reflect on the thousands of steps that came before me and the countless others that will come after me.